Hello, we've got Dan Kovalik for company today, March 11, and thanks Dan for coming.
Hey, my pleasure. It's all my pleasure. Thank you.
Dan Kovalik was born in Kentucky, was it Dan? Louisville,
Yeah,
Kentucky.
Louisville, Kentucky, the birthplace of Muhammad Ali as well. Yes.
Yeah, he's a labor rights lawyer. He's an author, a columnist. His book, one of his books is No More War, How the West Violates International Law by Using Humanitarian Intervention to Justify, economic and strategic interests, which I think will be very relevant to what we're going to talk about. And what we're going to talk about today is the 25th anniversary of the NATO bombing campaign on Yugoslavia. In the 24th of March, 1999, 25 years ago this month, NATO launched a massive bombing campaign on Yugoslavia, and it proceeded then for about 10 weeks from March until June. It was quite an unprecedented military campaign right in Europe by the US-led NATO alliance. So I'm going to put it to Dan Kovalik to talk us through that episode and what the ramifications were for today, subsequent history, 25 years right up to today. So Dan, please take the floor and give us a survey.
Yes. Well, first of all, I do talk about this in my book that you mentioned, the No More War book, because this was really the beginning of the humanitarian intervention era. I mean, obviously, every war and intervention has had some sort of humanitarian mask to it, going back as far as you want to go back. I mean, even Hitler claimed he was, invaded Czechoslovakia to protect Germans in the Sudetenland. Everyone claims they're invading someone else for lofty good purposes. But in terms of formulating what came to be known as humanitarian interventionism and R2P, the responsibility to protect, that really began under the Bill Clinton administration in the U.S. and Tony Blair administration in the United Kingdom.
What years? What year was this now?
We're talking in the 1990s, and it really was manifested best in the NATO attack on Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, in 1999. But leading up to that, that had to be that intervention, as all interventions like this, they had to pave the way for it. And one way they did it is, and again, I mention it in my book, on two different occasions, the U.S. scuttled possible peace agreements that would have just would have prevented the conflict to begin with, at least as bad as it had gotten. One was, I believe, as far back as 1992, the Lisbon Accords, which really, had they been agreed to, might have prevented all the bloodshed that we ended up seeing.
In Yugoslavia. In Yugoslavia. Yeah. Because
that's right.
Dan, if I just may interject here, the Americans and the Western allies were claiming that Serbia was aggressing the Albanians in the Kosovo province, and it's not right, they were intervening to protect, purportedly to protect the Albanian Kosovo people from Belgrade, the dominant province of Serbia. That's what they allege now.
That's what they alleged.
Right.
And the Bosnians as well, they alleged. You're right. But really none, the lion's share of the violence hadn't even started yet, again, back in 92. And frankly, as Noam Chomsky's pointed out, really didn't begin in earnest till after NATO started intervening. That, in fact, the worst bloodshed happened after NATO intervened and in response to it, in 99. But yes, what you're saying is correct. but again, the bloodshed largely could have been avoided had the Lisbon Agreement been agreed to. But the U.S. Prevailed upon, I believe it was Bosnia, to back out of that deal.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was the Rambouillet Agreement, which came later. I believe that was in '99, right before the NATO invasion. And again, the NATO invasion wouldn't have happened unless that agreement was scuttled. And so famously, the U.S. put in a poison pill in the Rambouillet Agreement. And that poison pill was to require, there were two, but the main one was it would have required Serbia to allow NATO occupation of Serbia. And as again, a number of commentators have said, no self-respecting nation would have agreed to that, and the U.S. knew it.
Mm-hmm.
Serbia was willing to agree to everything else, including withdrawing troops from some of the other republics. But again, the U.S. didn't want peace. They wanted war, and they wanted it because Clinton wanted to show that the U.S. and the West could go to war without Security Council authorization, based on this humanitarian interventionism.
Mm. I mean, Dan, this was only 8 years after the end of the Cold War, the supposed end of the Cold War, whenever there was supposed to be this great outbreak of peace between the Western camp and the Soviet Union that then dissolved. And just 8 years after this historic kind of a so-called peaceful denouement of the Cold War, 8 years later, we had the US-led military alliance attacking quite deep into Europe, near towards Russia's border. I mean, that was it was a dramatic turnaround from the promises of goodwill or kind of coexistence that George Bush Sr. had been giving to Mikhail Gorbachev in 1991.
That's exactly right. Yes. And again, the irony of ironies, as you say, is that the wars were supposed to end after, the conflict was supposed to end. And certainly Russia thought that it would. But that was never the intention of the West. The West always planned on using the collapse of the Soviet Union as, the opportunity to start really taking over the world at that point, because the Soviet Union had blocked that up to that point. The Soviet Union was a certain check on Western and imperialist intervention and expansion. And once the Soviet Union went down, the U.S. said, hey, now there's nothing holding us back. We have this, a new world order George Bush announced. Actually, back in '89, I believe he announced it, even before the Soviet Union collapsed. But by then, the Eastern Bloc had gone down. So he saw that opportunity even back then. And remember, he actually ordered the invasion of Panama in 1989, which most people forget about. And also, that had no Security Council authorization. Hundreds, if not thousands, of working class people were killed in working class neighborhoods in Panama City. And again, Bush did that in part to show the world that we could do it. There was no one to stop us anymore.
Yeah. Just to clarify, Dan, for listeners, that this intervention in Yugoslavia, I like the one you mentioned there in Panama, it had absolutely no mandate from the UN Security Council. I think right. Russia and China, Russia, the Soviet Union that became Russia, and China both vetoed the UN Security Council draft resolution for military intervention in Yugoslavia. So the United States and its Western allies did not have any legal basis, mandate to do what they did. It was a unilateral military action, which therefore, one could say was illegal. It was an illegal military action.
It was. And again, this was intentional. Bill Clinton made it clear, not publicly, but he made it clear privately that he wanted to do it outside the Security Council. He wanted to show the U.S. and the West could act alone under the cover of humanitarianism.
Yes.
And Yugoslavia was his first real experiment to show that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what
I doubt Dan Bill Clinton conceived of all of this on his own. I mean, he no doubt was being, coached and influenced by, deep state planners, imperial planners. Would you say? Like, I mean, I don't think it was Bill Clinton that came up with it all on his own.
No, no, there were others behind it. Madeleine Albright was one, who was his Secretary of State.
Hmm.
Samantha Power, who was not in government, is kind of one of the intellectuals, authors of it when she wrote her book, A Problem from Hell, about the U.S. not intervening to prevent genocide. She was one of the intellectual authors. And there were some from other countries, from Canada, from Australia. So
Hmm.
the West was coming up with this kind of collectively.
Hmm.
And again, as a means to carry out old timey colonial wars in the name of human rights.
Because Dan, what you're saying is once they set that precedent of military intervention, unilateral military intervention without a Security Council clearance or mandate, that was a very important precedent, a foot in the door, if you like, for then further military action around the world as they deemed fit.
That's correct.
Right. And then,
That's
well,
correct.
I'm sure you could talk us through then the next years after this Yugoslav intervention, this aggression in Yugoslav, 10 weeks of bombing. I think there's a couple of thousand people were killed. Um,
And all the civilian infrastructure was just leveled.
right. So after 1999, Dan, you have then, Afghanistan, Iraq,
Iraq,
Lib
Somalia,
Somalia,
on a smaller level. Yeah.
and
But
Libya,
I would say
2000.
those. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, 2011 Libya, and very much using the humanitarian pretext there about
Yes.
protecting some minority in the east of Libya, which turned out to be all quite fabricated. That concern. But it was pertinent to your book. It was a classic supposedly humanitarian intervention operation in Libya, using the Yugoslav precedent very much so. It was like the Yugoslav formula. So we had that in Libya, which then led on to the war in Syria. Libya was used by NATO as an arms conduit into Syria in 3 years later for a regime change, covert regime change operation in that country. Yes, Dan. So sorry to cut in on you, but um, if you would like to, talk more about that historical sweep from Yugoslavia.
Right. So you had the Yugoslav intervention again, which was a humanitarian intervention, type. Then, of course, as you mentioned, then you get into the war on terror under George W. Bush, which I think is a little different. He bases his wars allegedly on fighting terror, although, of course, in the end, the U.S. supports terror, but it's a whole nother story. But okay, those are conservatives and Republicans. Then you get back to the Obama administration, back to the liberals,
Mhm.
and he's got in his administration Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. He's got Samantha Power now. She's his ambassador to the United Nations. He's got Susan Rice as well. And so now you really have the humanitarian interventionist back in power. And as you say, their big project was Libya in 2011. And it's the fastest intervention you can ever imagine. I mean, there were some uprisings in Benghazi in February of 2011. NATO was bombing by March. I mean, there was no even time
Mhm.
taken to see if the allegations against Gaddafi were even true. And by the way, they weren't.
Mhm.
None of them were. The mass rapes was a lie. By the way, we see that lie against Hamas right now. This is a classic lie.
Mhm.
The same lie against the Russians in Ukraine. That was a lie. There was a lie that there was an imminent genocide in Benghazi. That wasn't true. And the worst lie of all, strange lie from the liberals, and that was they claimed that Gaddafi was using black mercenaries against people in Libya, when it turned out they weren't mercenaries at all. They were black people who were living in Africa. They were guest workers.
Yeah.
In fact, the story was you could tell the black mercenaries by their yellow helmets. Yeah, they were construction helmets. Okay. But why was this the worst lie? Because what this did is encourage the jihadists that NATO was backing to attack black people in Libya, which they did. So while the irony of ironies is that while the US and NATO claimed that they invaded to stop a genocide, they ended up promoting a genocide against the black Africans living in Libya. And that did happen. And whole towns were wiped out, black towns in Libya. This is an irony of ironies. The Democratic Party, which claims to be the party of black people in the United States, ends up promoting a genocide against black people in Libya. And now, even to this day, as a result of that NATO intervention, black people are being sold on the streets as slaves. So this is an incredible disaster in the name of human rights and humanitarian intervention that these crazies came up with. And, you know, there was some cynicism. If you see some of the, and again, in my book, I talk about this, there was some cynical things about it. That is that it's clear a number of the people involved didn't really believe they were there for humanitarian purposes. That is, that they were just lying about it. But I do think there were some involved who did believe, you know, they were doing it for humanitarian purposes. It was kind of the white man's burden type, old-timey racist thing. But they were wrong. Those people who believe that were wrong. But again, most of them seem to be pretty cynical about it and were just lying. Hillary was one of those people who just lied about it. And so you had this 9-month bombing of Libya, which ousted Gaddafi. It turned the most prosperous country in Africa into the least prosperous. It's now divided up into at least 3 different kind of camps, armed camps. Libya does not have one united government. It's a disaster. It was an unmitigated disaster. Obama even would later say his biggest regret is he didn't stabilize Libya afterwards. But the truth was he didn't even try. I mean, reminds me of this thing, you know, this scene in the Simpsons cartoon where Flanders' parents are with a psychiatrist and they said, "We've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas." I mean, they didn't try to bring stability there. In fact, it seemed that the goal was to bring instability. And you see that, as you say, in Ukraine, where really the West promoted the war there. And what has it brought the Ukrainians? Disaster, complete disaster. Ukraine will end up being balkanized.
I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, Dan. But just before we move on from Libya, I saw an interesting comparative figure that in Libya they bombed for, correct me now, Dan, but the NATO alliance bombed that country, that North African country, for I think it was 8 months, a little bit over 30 weeks. I saw official figures that there were something like 26,000 aerial sorties, military flights, 26,000 sorties. Now in Yugoslavia, the bombing was done over 10 weeks, so about a third of the time. And yet the sorties, the aerial sorties for that country are cited as 38,000 against 26,000, yet it was over a third of the shorter of the period. So, I mean, that tells you, if those figures are confirmed, that would tell you that what happened in Yugoslavia was pretty intensive bombing, that for them to fit in 38,000 sorties in 10 weeks, whereas in Libya it was 26,000 sorties over 10 10 weeks, 30 weeks, sorry. Anyway, my point is that it must have been a massively intense bombing operation in Yugoslavia. Dan, I'm going to go on to Ukraine. So how does the conflict in Ukraine fit into this historical process that began with, you could say with Yugoslavia, bombing Yugoslavia in 1999, 25 years ago, to the present war in Ukraine? Where do you see the war in Ukraine fitting into this trend or pattern over that 25 years?
Yeah, again, I mean, I think, well, first of all, it is a bit of a different war in the sense that the West and NATO are involved in it, but in a more indirect way than in Libya and Yugoslavia. They're not the ones doing the bombings, but they are the ones supplying the bombs, right? And so they're active in that sense. But the rationale is basically the same. The rationale is to, as in Yugoslavia, to defend, allegedly, this is the story, to defend an independent country, a country that became independent, in this case, Ukraine, from the Soviet Union, right? Back in 1991. And Russia, the big bad Russia, which allegedly wants to recreate the Soviet empire. Again, this is all fictitious, but this is the line. Invades Ukraine to as part of its mission to recreate the Soviet Union. And the West has to defend Ukraine from Russia, the Russian baddies, out of humanitarian concern, to protect human rights and to protect the sovereignty of Ukraine in the same way the US and NATO was allegedly protecting the sovereignty and human rights of the people in Kosovo and Bosnia from the Serbs, right? So while, again, while the method in this case is a little different, the rationale is basically the same. It's almost identical. Of course, it's not true, a lot of what has been said. It is true that Ukraine, became an independent republic in 1991. Certainly a lot of people in Ukraine wanted to do that, but many did not, particularly the people in the East, in the Donbass, who are Russian speaking. And not just that, they also are very loyal to the Soviet Union. As I found out, I've been to the Donbass twice in the last year and a half. And they're probably the most Soviet kind of patriots of all the peoples in the former Soviet Union. So they never really wanted that, but of course they didn't have a decision in that. Interestingly, Crimea, which is in play as well, which Ukraine claims dominance over and which wanted to be part of Russia, they had a referendum back in 1991 before the Soviet Union collapsed, asking to be a sovereign republic because they feared that if the Soviet Union went down, they did not want to be part of Ukraine. Right. So they never wanted to be part of Ukraine. But no one cares. The West doesn't care about the people of the Donbass or what they want or what the people of Crimea want, right? So, but it's much more complicated than the West claims. And then meanwhile, what did happen is, so the U.S. backed a coup in Ukraine in 2014, which brought to power a right-wing government, very pro-Western, but also very anti-Russian, including against its own Russian-speaking and ethnic population. Again, particularly in the Donbass. That's what led to the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk declaring independence in 2014. But again, the West didn't care about that. The West never recognized that. In fact, many have compared their declaration of independence to Kosovo's, which the West defended, even though Kosovo never had a referendum. They never had a popular referendum like Donetsk and Luhansk had. So that Luhansk and Donetsk, their independence was more legitimate. But the West never recognized that. So when they talk about, and then, of course, as we know, in September of 2022, Those two republics and two others voted in referenda to go with Russia. But again, the West doesn't care what they want, right? They claim they're defending the upstart Ukraine against Russia, but they're not. They don't defend the upstart Donbass people or Crimea people. They don't defend what they want, right? So it's all mythical what's being claimed. But it was also mythical what they were claiming about Yugoslavia too. But what is important for them isn't the facts, it's the myth. I mean, what are they promoting? And it is this kind of humanitarian interventionism. Of course, again, not to jump the gun too much, I mean, if there's any place in the world right now that deserves a humanitarian intervention, it's Gaza. But the West is actually supporting the genocide in Gaza. I mean, it's a joke. And that's what critics like myself have been saying for years. This humanitarian intervention stuff's nonsense. These people don't care about human rights. If they would, they'd be protecting Gaza. Minimally, they wouldn't be sending weapons to Israel right now, right? It's all a farce. It's all a lie. Just like, again, every war that's ever been fought has been based on a lie. This is just a new kind of lie. That's all.
Dan, it was. I think that's the killer argument that you just came out with there. You know, to expose the disingenuousness of the Western claims about humanitarian concern for their wars. Whenever you look at Gaza and they're actually arming, weaponizing, and giving cover for a genocide. I mean, it really is grotesque and absurd, but it exposes the bankruptcy of their argument perfectly. I'm glad you brought that up. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Dan Kovalik, I think we'll leave it there. Dan, you've covered so much in such a short period of time. I know you're wanting to get on with your travel plans. You're heading off tomorrow, I believe.
I'm going to Russia. Yeah, I was invited to be an observer for the elections there. I'm excited about that. Again, you know, I view my role, just so you know, in my journalist work, and I try to humanize the countries that the West is at war with and say, hey, these are not monsters. These are people just like us that we should be working with, not against. And so that's part of what I'll be doing when I'm in Russia.
Yeah. Dan, your work is tremendous, really. I mean, that book, No More War, How the West Violates International Law by Using Humanitarian intervention to promote their economic interests. It's such a brilliant, such a brilliant expose of Western hypocrisy and corruption. It's a must read for anybody who's trying to understand international conflicts. So Dan Kovalik, thank you so much for your time today and explaining this anniversary of the 25th anniversary of NATO bombing of Yugoslavia and how that is pertinent, relevant to the war in Ukraine and so many other conflicts that followed from the war in Yugoslavia. So thanks very much, Dan. Good bon voyage with your travels, and hope to hear your reports on what you find pretty soon.
Thank you, Finian, and I wish everyone a happy St. Patrick's Day, which is coming up, and free Ireland. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. All the best.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.